You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 15th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, Israel continues its bombardment of Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Those charged with bringing about a ceasefire suggest progress is being made. We'll have the latest from Beirut as the displacement crisis ramps up as winter approaches. Also coming up, after the collapse of the coalition government, we look ahead to federal elections in Germany, plus
we learned this week that unlike certain US presidents-elect we may come to presently, some people will take the hint after beclowning themselves on the world stage just the once.
Andrew Muller takes us through the last extraordinary days in what we learned, and we go through to Friday's papers, hear about the winner of the World Building of the Year award, and
Rome has taken everything from me, but I will have my vengeance.
Gird your loins, it's time for Gladiator 2. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. Donald Trump has nominated the former presidential candidate and anti-vaccine activist Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be his health secretary. Meanwhile, a leading Republican senator says he wants to review an unreleased report on sexual misconduct allegations against Donald Trump's choice for Attorney General Matt Gaetz. And Israel says it's hit military sites in the Syrian capital of Damascus, targeting the headquarters of the Islamic Jihad group. Stay tuned for more on these stories throughout the day on Monocle Radio. But first, let's have a look ahead. Let's just consider the announcements that have come in overnight from the United States. Joining me in the studio is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor. Welcome to the studio.
Good morning, Emma.
We'll be covering this a little bit more in detail in a little while in the paper review. But let's just reflect on the speed and the nature of surprise that the Trump appointments are. I think perhaps not great surprise, but all very shocked that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been appointed or been nominated to be in charge of America's health with no qualifications and a reputation for some pretty out there views.
This was much signalled, though, it has to be pointed out. Lots of people were expecting RFK Jr. to get this role, and obviously it's significant because he's a vaccine skeptic. And although he and President-elect Donald Trump claimed that essentially what he wants to do is make America healthy again by smashing the stranglehold Donald Trump feels that some of the food lobby industry and some parts of the medical industry have over American consumers. Obviously, there's huge outcries you can expect in professional medical quarters about this very, very controversial appointment here. Not only because, as you point out, RFK Jr. is a vaccine skeptic, a well-signalled and signposted one, but he also believes that things like 5G phone and internet communication masts cause leaky brains, as he claims it. He's against fluoride being put in water to stop children have cavities in their teeth because he believes it affects their biology. And his own health organisation that he's set up to sort of, defend some of these claims that, by the way, are unproven in medical science, has also been accused of having promulgated such anti-vaccine skepticism that it actually cost 83 people their lives in Guam, and many of those were children as well, something he denies. But obviously you can see, healthcare professionals very, very concerned. One of them was calling it a, excuse my French, beep, 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 nightmare appointment just overnight.
It's an interesting thing that what seems to be happening here is we've also got the appointment in the last 24 hours, or the nomination, I should say, about the new Attorney General Matt Gaetz. Again, a character who was being investigated for sexual misconduct, who also seems to be a shoo-in. There seems to be a sort of quite clearly a repayment for loyalty here by Donald Trump.
There's a repayment for loyalty, and there's also a prize on anti-establishment behaviour as well. I think essentially what Donald Trump is trying to capture here is the electorate's anger at the traditional establishment in Washington, D.C. And these are the most controversial candidates he could have picked to signal that. As you said, it's also loyalty that's been rewarded here, despite the fact that many experts in political circles in Washington, but on both sides of the Atlantic, fear that many of these appointments that Donald Trump has made, they might not even stand the test of scrutiny because they're going to have to be vetted by Congress as well, remember? And that vetting process is quite thorough. Some of these appointments may just be, as I was saying before, sort of throwing a sort of bone to populist views, but they're not actually feasible. We'll see whether that comes to pass or not. You mentioned Matt Gaetz, who, of course, is hugely controversial in the Attorney General role, not least because he's been investigated for things himself. No charges brought as yet, but he still faces one House investigation that's not yet over. There's other people, including Tulsi Gabbard, who's been accused of pushing Russian narratives over the invasion of Ukraine. She'll be nominated for Director of National Intelligence, hugely sensitive role there. And other Five Eyes countries that share their intelligence with America will be worried about that, not least Pete Hegseth, a Fox News anchor for defence.
Nina, stay with us. Well, you'll be back in a little while to bring us the newspaper review. But for the moment, Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, thank you so much. The time here in London is just nudging 7 minutes past 7, 7 minutes past 9 in Beirut, which is where we head now. Because could there be signs of progress towards a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah? Yesterday, the US submitted a draft truce proposal to Lebanon's parliament. Meanwhile, Israel's bombing of Hezbollah-controlled targets continues. And Leila Malana Allen is Monocle's Middle East correspondent. She joins me on the line from Beirut. Very good morning to you, Leila.
Morning.
And there have been more strikes in the last 24 hours, haven't there?
There have. The strikes have really been picking up again. There had been a little bit of a lull on the strikes in Beirut over the last week, but in just the last 48 hours, the IDF says it's hit at least 30 targets in the suburbs of Beirut. And of course, we hear each of those as they go off. We see the smoke rising. It's a small city, and most of those areas have now been evacuated, but the strike areas continue to spread. And so that does mean many civilians are still being killed. We're now looking at 3,500 people in Lebanon have been killed in these strikes. 14,500 wounded. A third of those are women and children. So there are still many civilians, because the problem is these high-rise buildings that the IDF hits when it carries out these strikes are full of civilians. They're residential buildings. And the same is happening in the south of the country and in the Bekaa Valley now as well, where towns and villages in the south are just being flattened in an attempt, essentially, many people here think, to create a buffer zone similar to what happened when Israel occupied the south of Lebanon up until 2000.
Israel says that it is targeting areas which it knows are Hezbollah strongholds. But if you are in Beirut now, and you have known Beirut for years and years, what's daily life like?
So here's the problem. When you say you're targeting Hezbollah areas are theoretically a third of the country. A third of the country is Shia Muslim. Of course, they're not all Hezbollah supporters, but many of the areas that Hezbollah runs, are where Shia Muslims and many others live. I mean, the suburbs of Beirut are not just an area where Shia Muslims live. It's also one of the poorest areas of the city. And so it's where many immigrant workers live. It's where many low-income workers live. It's where many university students who can't afford to live in the center of the city live. There's a highly packed residential area. You can't really define, there's a weapons depot here, so we're going to hit that without targeting all the civilian buildings around it. And one of the other problems with the assassinations that we've been seeing is that to go after one Hezbollah commander or fighter, the IDF will hit a building and often kill 30, 60 civilians in doing so. Sometimes they'll get that target, sometimes they won't. So it's a question of proportionality. And people here really feel that's gone out the window. Indeed, as well, as I say, the strike areas continue to spread. Sometimes there are warnings, but often there aren't. And when those warnings do come now, really, it's a few minutes afterwards that the strikes begin. So there's really no time to get out at all. So as people walk the streets, they're doing their best to live daily life. But anywhere can be a target now. We've seen strikes at the very heart of Beirut. minutes from the parliament buildings, places that people would previously have thought were safe, around diplomatic residences. Most of the embassies now have evacuated all their non-essential staff. Many people have fled to the north where they can. A lot of people have fled to the east side of Beirut, which theoretically they think is safer. But as I say, every day the situation here changes. So people are doing their best to carry on with daily life, but many people now aren't working. And really the streets are just full of displaced people. We've seen nearly 1.5 million people displaced from their homes, and people are doing their best to stay in places like schools, in shelters. Most of the schools are out because they're accommodating displaced people, but children are sleeping on the streets, and winter's coming. The rains are going to start soon. And when they do, the streets of the capital flood, and it's going to be really an escalating crisis as winter carries on.
So tell us a little bit more about this displacement. I mean, when people are leaving their homes in Beirut, is there a sense that they are coming back, or is there a sense that they do not know when things will settle down, and there could be a touch of permanency to this?
Well, that's increasingly the feeling. Initially when the IDF was putting out these warnings, and they still continue to say, we will let you know when it's safe to come home. Now, they've issued what they call evacuation notices for nearly a third of the country at this point. Vast swathes of the south of Lebanon, now the city of Baalbek and its surrounds, where nearly 1 million people live in the Bekaa Valley. And what people are increasingly seeing now, they're sitting in Beirut or wherever they've evacuated to, and they're watching their homes be destroyed. They're watching entire villages and towns be flattened. There is no chance of going back there. The footage that we're seeing from areas that we can't get to because it's far too dangerous are essentially, as I say, dust. There aren't buildings left. So, and that's the same now as happening in the suburbs of Beirut, where hundreds of thousands of people live. It will take years potentially to rebuild these areas, and that's if they're able to even go back and rebuild these places. There's talk of the IDF, as I say, saying that they might occupy the south of Lebanon again. So people are increasingly feeling that this is becoming a permanent crisis. And part of the problem is, of course, that Lebanon has been in crisis for 5 years. It doesn't have a proper government. It hasn't had a government for over 2 years now because it can't elect a president. That means it's a caretaker government that can't really implement policy. It's also had the third worst financial crisis in history over the last few years. We heard yesterday that there's a combined now $8.5 billion in combined physical damage and economic losses to Lebanon. Now, over the last few years, they've been doing everything they can to make enough reforms just to get hold of $3 billion from the World Bank to be able to try and implement some reforms in the country that it needed before this war started. So the crisis really is on an epic scale. And everyone here feels that Western partners aren't really addressing and understanding what's happening, as daily they talk about some potential ceasefire deal. But again, this repeated phrase that Israel has the right to defend itself. Yesterday, there was a strike meters from a plane on the runway at the airport, and people here think that no one really understands the scale of what's happening, how many people are dying, how many people's lives are being destroyed, while the Western world really just gets on with its daily life.
Let's move on to any possibility of a ceasefire. Yesterday, the United States, as I mentioned a moment ago, submitted a draft truce proposal to Lebanon's parliament. And that is being widely reported as a potentially good sign.
It is a potentially good sign. This is the first actual written proposal that we've seen in several weeks. Now, firstly, to be clear, this is just something that's been submitted to the Speaker of Parliament for comments, essentially, from Lebanese MPs, to feed back on their ideas about this. One of the main sticking points we are seeing is that the Israeli authorities are determined that they will not give up what they want to be in the proposal, which is that they have the right to start attacks again and what they call enforce the deal if they see any signs from Hezbollah of fighting back, of trying to kind of reinitiate conflict in that border area. We have heard rumblings from Hezbollah that they are now willing to pull back from the southern border. Of course, we've seen the decimation of Hezbollah's political leadership, but we haven't seen the decimation of their fighting forces. Israel says that they think they've taken out the majority of Hezbollah's weapons depots, at least around Beirut, but they are continuing to strike every day. So there's clearly more places that they think there's still weaponry. In the south, Hezbollah is still very strong. We saw 6 Israeli soldiers killed this week and fighting on the border. They've had a really hard time trying to fight Hezbollah troops there, who obviously know the terrain so well. So the idea for the Lebanese authorities that Israel essentially has carte blanche to step in again and violate ceasefire terms whenever they want to is completely unacceptable. The other thing they've been asking for is essentially control of Lebanese airspace, being able to bring planes in whenever they like, control of part of sea space as well in the south. That's completely unacceptable to Lebanese authorities. So these are the kind of issues that are being hashed out. And of course, one of the big issues as well is the reality is in January, the government's going to change in the US. The US is the main broker of these talks. There's not much motivation right now on the part of Israel to make any more concessions because they think that the Trump administration will be even more favorable to them than the Biden administration has been. Meanwhile, as I say, daily life in Lebanon is becoming more hellish by the day. People here are desperate for a ceasefire deal, but they're not willing to sacrifice the sovereignty of the country and potentially enter an occupation situation in order to get that deal.
Briefly, let's talk a little bit about the incoming Trump administration. I mean, we get the impression that conversations have been had that Trump would effectively endorse Israel to effectively finish the job in Gaza, in Lebanon, and perhaps even in Iran. What is the sense like where you are?
Indeed. I mean, there is a lot of fear about that. Of course, we saw in the last Trump administration, really punchy moves, riding roughshod over kind of what had been the established structure of US ideals for Middle East peace. Things like moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, which was always supposed to be a prize for the Israeli government if they were willing to establish a two-state solution. That happened anyway. That obviously caused huge riots across the country and huge concern in Lebanon as well. What we've seen is interesting during the election campaign. Trump really lent into saying, actually, I'm the guy who wants to stop the wars because war isn't good for business. I'm actually your best chance of a Middle East peace plan. He, of course, has a Lebanese son-in-law and has put out, lots of statements saying, oh, I'm going to end this war. I know you don't want it. Lebanon's an important place to me and it's an important partner for us. But the moves we've seen over the last few days really haven't indicated that that's the approach that this administration is going to take. The appointment of Mike Huckabee as the new ambassador potentially to Israel. What we've seen from Huckabee is when his last trip to the West Bank, he essentially said there is no occupation. It doesn't exist. Israel should have the right to have a complete one-state solution, to be in charge of this entire country. He said Palestinians don't exist. These are the kind of statements from somebody who's potentially going to be negotiating in this conflict that are really concerning to people. Equally, Pete Hegseth, who's just been appointed defense minister, this is a man who said that he wants a Jewish temple to be built on the Al-Aqsa compound, the most holy site in the area for Muslims, a real flashpoint for violence. So all the kind of rumblings we're seeing are that this administration will be even more leaning towards the Israeli far right. Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel is clearly elated by what he sees as complete now carte blanche to do whatever he likes. So there's great concern that really it's going to be what we're going to see in the coming months is potentially annexation of the West Bank, no chance of a two-state solution. That, of course, floods over into Lebanon in terms of whether there's going to be support for Israel trying to annex part of the south of Lebanon for what they call this buffer zone. It really does seem to people here that they increasingly don't have any support from Western allies and that this is going to be an administration that's going to ride roughshod over any rights they have in whatever peace deal comes out of this multi-front war.
Leila Malala Allen, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Beirut. Coming up on The Globalist.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the North, general of the Felix Legions, loyal servant to the true emperor Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance.
And he did. Some famous dialogue there from Russell Crowe, but does the sequel to Ridley Scott's Academy Award-winning Gladiator live up to expectations? We'll find out later on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
8:20 in Paris, 7:20 here in London. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me once again in the studio is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor, and the person who's done all the heavy lifting with the papers this morning. Welcome back, Nina.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Emma.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into these appointments by Donald Trump. And we've talked about you've mentioned the alarm bells being raised by so many quarters, but how are the papers covering it this morning? And we were looking at the New York Times, and it's actually trying to play it as straight as it can, actually. It's a really difficult line that the media have to tread at the moment.
Well, there are some slightly more typical figures, if you like, that have given some people in different political quarters some room for breathing space, if you like. And I'm thinking most notably Senator Marco Rubio. Just last night, by the way, I was at a big Human Rights Awards event, which brings together lots of US senators as well to London, and people from Latin America, and a lot of the Latino community who are sitting next to me were saying, well, look, the fact that Marco Rubio will be defending this cohort's views around the world and also be quite hawkish on China gives us some hope. So there are some figures who are, if you like, the more conventional politicians who might be able to sort of steady the ship a little bit. But obviously, yes, as you were saying before, lots of the foreign press very much alarmed at the prospect of RFK Jr., Bobby Kennedy's son, finding himself in such a crucial position when it comes to healthcare, being the health secretary when he's an anti-vaxxer. There's also real concerns about the lack of experience of people like Pete Hegseth, who has been nominated as defense secretary, just largely because he's a veteran and also a rather clever Ivy League graduate and a very prominent Fox News host who's had the chance to lobby Donald Trump on various veterans issues over the past and develop a personal relationship with him. I think the real fear in many of the British press is that these aren't traditional politicians, and it's going to be quite difficult dealing with them if they want to get a trade deal or various other bilateral arrangements off the ground, especially with the Labour government, which obviously is on the other side of the political spectrum here. It's
interesting here that the New York Times has highlighted Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, as an interesting character, not least because, as we mentioned earlier, he has no qualifications. He was a Democrat and was and then jumped over to Trump and is being rewarded accordingly.
Even though they've traded insults in the past.
That doesn't seem to matter anymore, does it? It's let bygones be bygones. But the interesting thing that the New York Times is focusing on is that Kennedy can now bring into the fold what the New York Times calls the crunchy granola moms, those who are sort of anti-public health establishment, those who, for an example, Kennedy loves drinking unpasteurized milk, and this is a thing. So this is an interesting moment when actually the sort of like the left-wing traditional Democrat voters that may well be brought into the fold simply because Kennedy has that sort of borderline view.
He does, and he's been able to disseminate that view of his via social media. And obviously, as we know, Elon Musk is going to play a huge, albeit non-official role on the sidelines in this new Trump administration. People like Elon Musk and the other Silicon Valley tycoons who've been basically betting their cards on Donald Trump returning to office for quite some time now, they have quite a different view of the democratic system, it seems, or what they believe it should be like in the world's biggest and most powerful democracy than, certainly your traditional politicians from the Democrat side. And they also have a lot of data on what these kind of yoga pant wearing, unpasteurized milk drinking, granola bar nibbling, say, suburban mums or urban mums or others, believe. And they've been able to steer those views and rally them quite effectively. So it's not just RFK, Robert Kennedy Jr., it's also people like Elon Musk as well. I think what we're seeing is this sort of it's going to be a really different administration to anything we've ever seen anywhere else if some of these positions actually make it through scrutiny and Congress approval.
The whole thing is it seems to be wildly experimental. I mean, we're looking at, if we can touch briefly on the ex-Twitter post from the Department of Government Efficiency, the newly formed Doge. And I'm just going to just read out what Elon Musk has tweeted. We're very grateful to the thousands of Americans who've expressed interest in helping us at Doge. We don't need more part-time idea generators. We need... Here we go. Super high IQ, small government revolutionaries willing to work 80 plus hours per week on unglamorous cost cutting. If that's you, DM this account with your CV. Elon will review the top 1% of applicants. Basically, this is, who on earth is going to apply for that kind of thing? Someone who isn't going to be paid 80 hours plus, super IQ, determined to scrape out the insides of a government.
Can I guarantee you something? AI will probably look at the 99% of others. And, this is the traditional problem we have in all sorts of industries we're finding now, where AI is very much enmeshed in the recruiting process. Lots of people who are very worthy don't make the cut because the computer just essentially says no. And aside from the fact that America, with its very, very sort of strongly acute capitalist model, has very few social safety nets, which is why, as we saw, so many people turn out and vote for Donald Trump, because essentially they also voted with their pockets. They may not agree with some of these appointments that he's put on the table. Some of them may agree wholeheartedly, but even if they don't, they essentially are very concerned about the state of the economy and very concerned about inflation having eaten away at their pay packets. So when somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy, who's hugely wealthy, and also Elon Musk, who's the wealthiest man on earth and became even wealthier, by the way, after Donald Trump's victory just the other day, when they start saying, well, if you believe that you're like us, you've got a high IQ, and you really believe in this vision of small government, not more government, smaller government, then come and work for us for free. Only people from Silicon Valley who might have made some money on stock options could afford to take up such an offer. And also just kind of goes against the grain of what we believe American society is, which is you work for your money.
Let's move on to a story that was rumbling around last night. The Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, did a speech in London, and in it, he called for the United Kingdom to rebuild ties with the European Union. He made it absolutely clear in an entirely neutral way that the economy had been damaged by Brexit. And he and indeed the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, both stood up and said, look, we cannot go against the will of the people from Brexit. We can't rejoin the single market, but we need to rebuild ties with the European Union. And I sort of scratched my head and went, well, how's he going to do that then?
And I scratched my head and thought he's had many years to say it in that role. But obviously, this is the first time that he's got a government that feels quite differently about the EU and isn't tying itself into knots over whether or not it should or shouldn't have left and how to actually leave after the country had voted to leave the EU. So what I view this as is Andrew Bailey essentially giving Rachel Reeves cover for a Labour government that doesn't want to say that Brexit was an entire mistake because, as you pointed out, they don't want to alienate large chunks of the electorate that because of Brexit were tempted towards the Conservatives for a very short period and have now come back to Labour. But the reality is that, everybody's going to be looking for a trade deal with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is potentially going to start a trade war with all of these different countries. Donald Trump is promising double-digit tariffs of up to 20% for goods coming from the UK and the EU to the United States, up to 60% for China. What that'll do is cause all of these different blocs to start ratcheting up their own trade tariffs in retaliation. So this could really dent world economic growth, and that's the real backdrop to why it's focusing minds when it comes to the UK finding itself in a position of whether or not it has to choose to do everything it can to get some kind of trade deal with Donald Trump, leveraging the fact that they know he's transactional, but that he's a very, very difficult and fickle negotiator? Or do they, on the other hand, pivot back towards Europe and look for that comfort that they had once when they had so much trade with the other side of the channel?
How do you think Europe's going to take that?
We don't know. Well, it's an interesting moment for him to make this comment because remember that the European Commission is just now finally getting the top team in action because all of those EU commissioners for the second term of Ursula von der Leyen that were nominated had to go through the vetting process in the European Parliamentary Commissions just over the last couple of weeks. So the final round of that has now finished and they've gotten through. So the EU will start reassembling from the 1st of December. And I think that's when we'll have to see whether or not they're amenable to closer ties with the UK. And essentially with the UK, as I said, it finds itself in a juncture where it may have to decide whether to buddy up, back up with Europe or to take its chances with Donald Trump on the other side of the Atlantic.
Finally, let's talk about a brilliant article that you brought to our attention from The Times about if you're going to be a criminal with some style or indeed fancy dress.
If you go into the suburbs of Los Angeles today, you better be aware that there may be a bear that could attack your Mercedes-Benz and take it away. I mean, essentially what this Times article is talking about is how this bunch of criminals disguised in bear suits were eventually caught by insurance companies because they were breaking into cars and then making claims about how those cars might have been attacked by bears. But there was video of them doing this, and the insurance company got suspicious when they saw what looked like a bear walking like a human. And so they enlisted a biologist who said, yeah, that's definitely a human in a bear costume. They raided the apartments of these, I think it was 4 individuals who've now all been arrested, and they found great big bear costumes. And I've got to say that the pictures in the Times of these bear costumes are quite entertaining. Maybe they got Yeti versions as well, and we'll find out whether the abominable snowman is or isn't real, or just a bunch of burglars.
It's absolutely worth looking at this up, not least, as you say, because of the bear costumes, but what they were trying to steal. Because the California Department of Insurance said suspects filed a claim in January stating that a bear entered their 2010 Rolls-Royce Ghost while it was parked in the San Bernardino Mountains. I mean, they weren't just going for little things. They had their eyes on the big prizes.
They did, and Mercedes, various Mercedes cars as well. And when they raided their premises, what they found was not just bear costumes, but sort of fake claws. You know, these metal fake claws, a bit like Wolverine, that could sort of scratch the seats, and then they would get this insurance claim, get the seats redone and the car leatherwork redone, and make money from it that way. I suppose it's the funniest example of insurance fraud that we've seen for quite some time. And, you know, there are people, I spent a lot of time in that part of California as a child, actually, and because my parents had a footprint there. And I would say there are communities that there are a bear paw print, not quite, with a Rolls-Royce Ghost in the backyard, but hey, one can dream. But there are lots of communities in the mountainous parts of southern and northern California that do have problems with bears. So this is really actually quite unhelpful for people who do put in insurance claims. It might seem weird to us in other countries listening to this thinking, hang on, could you imagine putting an insurance claim saying a bear trashed my property? But it is an issue in some parts of California.
Nina Dos Santos, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson, live on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is 7:32 a.m. A quick look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Donald Trump has nominated the former presidential candidate and anti-vaccine activist Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be his health secretary. The president-elect had promised to let Kennedy go wild with health and food policy. A leading Republican senator says he wants to review an unreleased report on sexual misconduct allegations against Donald Trump's choice for Attorney General Matt Gaetz. John Cornyn said he didn't want any limitation on the committee considering the nomination. Israel says it's hit military sites in the Syrian capital Damascus, targeting the headquarters of the Islamic Jihad group. Syrian state media claim that residential buildings were hit, killing up to 15 people. And the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, has called for Britain to rebuild relations with the European Union while respecting the decision of the British people to leave the bloc. In a speech in London, he said Brexit had weighed on the economy. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, just when you thought that the end of 2024 would bring the conclusion of a year's worth of elections, the start of 2025 will produce another major vote, this time in Germany. The collapse of the coalition government is behind this poll, whose date has been set for February the 23rd. Mark that in your diaries. We're joined now from Berlin by Aaron Burnett, who's Security Policy Fellow with the European Resilience Initiative. Very good morning to you, Aaron.
Good morning, Emma.
Thank you for joining us on Monocle Radio. So a date has been set. Is this a good thing?
I would say yes, for the most part it is. We came here from a historically unpopular government. Polls all last year basically showed that only about 14% of Germans, yes, that is 14% of Germans, are satisfied with the work of this governing coalition, the center-left leaning coalition, as well as the Liberals. that left government when Olaf Scholz fired his finance minister. And 46% were very dissatisfied. Also, Olaf Scholz has been tremendously weak, for example, on support for Ukraine, right at a time, of course, when Donald Trump is taking office in the White House, and his cabinet picks are leaving us, especially Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, are leaving us really, really, really questioning his commitment to actual, upholding American and Western world security. So this really is a good time for Germany to be having elections, given the weakness of the chancellor on foreign policy, at least in the longer term. In the short term, it's not so great because, of course, it introduces a Germany that is going to, for the next several months, be preoccupied with itself politically and not really able to issue a answer to what's happening in Washington, at least not right away.
What is happening in Germany at the moment in terms of the way that people feel and the way that their lives are being changed by all this? Because what we've gone from a long period of stability with Angela Merkel, Mutti, steering the ship, and then the inability of Germany's politicians to actually come to any kind of, or create any kind of functioning coalition, suggested that actually without Merkel, Germany was not the stable, reliable place that many thought it to be.
Well, the thing about Angela Merkel, though, is that a lot of these problems that we are currently seeing in Germany right now, economically, politically, really did start with her 16 years. The state of the infrastructure that we have in Germany, particularly around our state railway, where only about 2/3 of all trains actually arrive at their destination on time. I mean, that really flies in the face of the myth of German efficiency, right? A lot of that really really comes from Merkel's 16 years in tenure, the neglect and investment that happened during that period of time. Our energy dependency on Russia was built up during Merkel, and a lot of work had to be done by this particular coalition to make up for that, to actually wean ourselves off of Russian gas, which to its credit, this particular governing coalition did. It also reinvested a lot of money into the railway, but it's going to take years for us to see the effects of that. Merkel also made us much more dependent on China, for example, in our economic model than would really be desirable. Of course, this is something that this particular coalition is not taking seriously either, the extent to which we're dependent on China. So the export-oriented model really is suffering because the Chinese are now able to produce a lot of the things that they used to depend on us for. That's having a huge effect on German exports in the model. So we are in the middle of an economic crisis. But one thing that has come up here that's really, I think, very interesting is that the German public want leadership from their government. We have seen, polls that indicate that Germans think a lot differently than they did a few years ago. Just a few days ago, we had one poll that came out that said 50% of Germans support the idea of spending 3 to 3.5% of GDP on defense. I mean, that's unheard of a couple of years ago. 60% of Germans say that weapons deliveries to Ukraine should stay or even be increased. 84% want to become less dependent on China. And these are all things that this government really is just not equipped to do.
Aaron Burnett in Berlin, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were The Globalist. It's 18:39 in Sydney, 8:39 a.m. in Zurich. And it's time now for a look at what we learned this week. Who else to bring us that but Andrew Muller?
We learned this week that unlike certain US presidents-elect we may come to presently, some people will take the hint after beclowning themselves on the world stage just the once. We learned of the retirement of Australian breaker Rachel Gunn, who, under the nom de dance Ray Gunn, rather stole the show at the Paris Olympics, with a routine sadly difficult for an audio-only medium to do proper justice, though we can provide the soundtrack if you will imagine a walrus suffering food poisoning, which was kind of what it looked like at the time. We learned, however, at least those of us who tuned into the weekend's NFL fixture between the Minnesota Vikings and the Jacksonville Jaguars learned, and if we're honest, it wasn't a classic, that while Ray Gun may be gone, she is not forgotten. At least not by Viking safety Cam Bynum, who celebrated a game-winning end-zone interception with a familiar-looking series of ungainly exertions.
And Bynum with his patented celebrations.
Australian breakdancing style to close it out.
Except, we then learned that reports of Ray Gun's retirement may have been greatly exaggerated.
Oh no.
Well, quite.
It's not a decision that I did come to. This turned into a story. So I was talking on Today FM about how I'm not going to do certain competitions anymore, which didn't seem like such a big deal because breaking's not going to be in the Olympics anyway. But I'm still going to be part of community jams, or I'd like to go to community jams and still dance and still break.
Yes, it seems that where breaking is concerned, she intends to preserve her connection. Come on, jams, preserve, that was gold. Or at least closer to it than Ray Gun was ever going to get. There we go. All of which is by way of avoiding dealing with the fact that we also learned quite a lot about the future governance of the free world. We learned that shortly to be reinstalled President Donald Trump does have some capacity for forgiveness, as we learned that he intends to anoint as his Secretary of State this guy.
The stakes are giving control of the party of Lincoln and Reagan, of the conservative movement, and ultimately of the United States over to a con artist. That will not happen.
Specifically, Florida Senator and flexible thinker Marco Rubio, who was a commendably staunch never-Trumper right up until the moment he perceived it expedient to change his tune. Come on, keep them coming.
This is what we're going to have.
Here's the guy that inherited $200 million. If he hadn't inherited $200 million, you know where Donald Trump would be right now? Selling watches in Manhattan.
Never gets old, and who can forget?
For years to come, there are many people on the right, in the media, and voters at large that are going to be having to explain and justify how they fell into this trap of supporting Donald Trump.
Or perhaps we learned Trump just wants Rubio out of the country, and for that much at least. Who can blame him? We also learned that Trump perhaps wishes to be reckoned merely the second most annoying individual in his administration, as we learned that he had outsourced cost reduction to his head cheerleader Elon Musk. And we are forced to concede that Musk does have considerable credentials where reducing costs is concerned. He has, for example, reduced the cost of the social media septic tank X from the $44 billion he paid for it 2 years ago to the $9 billion it is presently valued at now. Sorry, I'm hearing $8 billion. We learned that Musk and fellow billionaire nitwit Vivek Ramaswamy are to be placed in charge of a new Department of Government Efficiency, at least until such time as they fall publicly and melodramatically out with Trump and or each other, so for about 3 days. So we learned that Trump's first masterstroke for reducing the federal government is to create a new department of the federal government, a bit like when he promised to eliminate the national debt last time out and ended up adding $8 trillion to it. We further learned, by indicator of where it is we may well be at, that the name of the Department of Government Efficiency appears to have been chosen to abbreviate to Doge, which, for the benefit of listeners who go outside occasionally, socialise amiably with their fellow humans, that kind of thing, is a winking reference to a semi-joke cryptocurrency which credulous rubes bought eagerly into before it was revealed to be worth nothing at all. And does that sound like a metaphor for any particular modern American political movement? Well, does it? But we learned that as the president-elect worked his way up through the gears to actually appointing a horse a senior advisor, this is a learned reference to the famously feckless Roman Emperor Nero, look it up afterwards, we had not heard the half of it. We learned that the Secretary of Defense was to be this guy, specifically Fox News host and soap spokesmodel Peter Hegseth.
You see, one-man army loves the country and makes damn good soap. I've used them all,
And I love these new brands. Like Gunsmoke, smells like American firepower.
Righto. We learned that Trump's nominee for Attorney General is Florida, inevitably Congressman Matt Gaetz, who does at least have a passing familiarity with judicial process.
CBS News is reporting the Justice Department will not be charging Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz as part of a sex trafficking investigation.
Well, that's something. And we learned that the proposed Director of National Intelligence is former Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. And while all the jokes are right there about how making Tulsi Gabbard Director of National Intelligence is like making Rudolph Giuliani Director of National Coherence, this is, regrettably, not the least of it. So we learned, or were reminded via a brisk flip through the public record, that pending confirmation by the US Senate, the Western world's most powerful intelligence official will be an enthusiastic and unapologetic shill for the president of Russia. Verily, the Republican Party has been on a journey from this,
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall,
to this.
Presidents Putin, Zelensky, and Biden, it's time to put geopolitics aside and embrace the spirit of aloha.
It would honestly be more reassuring to discover Moscow was paying her. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Thank you, Andrew. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Time to talk about film news with our critic Karen Krizanovich, who I'm delighted to say joins me in the studio. Good morning, Karen.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm really well.
You look... I'm really well.
Well, outside of getting over the cold that everybody has.
Yeah, this is London in November. This is this is just it.
Boosts your immune system.
Right. Let's talk about films. We've trawled heavily ahead for Gladiator 2. And I've got written here, ask Karen about pros and cons of Gladiator 2. What do you want to do first, cons or pros?
Oh, wow. Oh, me. Sorry,
yes,
I thought you were asking the producer who already doesn't like the film. I'm going to go pro because, okay, Ridley Scott's 86. This is his 53rd directing project. I mean, that's counting television series and everything else. And it is basically a reboot of the Gladiator story, but still dovetailed into the one with Russell Crowe. You know, the one where he strokes the wheat as he's walking and he's dead. Okay. Spoiler alert, he dies. Okay. But Gladiator 2 fits in with that, but is a completely different film.
In what way?
Excuse me. Number one, Paul Mescal. There's no youthened Russell Crowe. We've got Denzel Washington as I think of a Senate member or anyway, a very powerful man who takes him under his wing and sort of uses him. And it's a wonderful performance by Denzel Washington. They're thinking he could get a supporting actor nomination. Connie Nielsen as Marcus Aurelius' daughter. She's amazing. Pedro Pascal looks like the new Brando. Amazing. But also, let's talk about the recreation of Rome itself and of the Colosseum and of fighting. And no, they didn't ride rhinos, but there's one of those that's being ridden in this movie.
Which, of course, we all look for. Is the only reason why we're going to see it. So you have Ridley Scott, Rome, some absolutely first-class acting there, or actors.
Actually, yeah, believe it or not, you've got a great cast, and I'm not a big fan of Paul Mescal, as a rule. I don't really like him in a lot of stuff he's done before, but he's great in this.
So this, in theory, should be an absolute winner. Why is there a note for cons?
Well, I think people are comparing it to Gladiator, which it shouldn't be compared to because it's like Gladiator, but it's not. It's a Ridley Scott movie, so it's epic. It does have certain Ridley Scott-esque features, like sometimes there's a filter on what we're looking at. Sometimes we can see that it's just really intense VFX. I mean, of course, he didn't rebuild the entire Roman army. It is visual effects. But it's just it's a great story. And I think people get upset when it's a nice, big, juicy story for just popcorn crunching people. You know, it's not intellectual particularly, although there is Virgil poetry in it, if you like. And it's just a nice, big, juicy story. And I think people can find that upsetting. And also, it's very easy to criticize. I mean, working in the film industry as I do, it's very easy to criticize creativity.
Let's talk about the future of Hollywood at the moment. I mean, everybody is looking at what's going to happen in the United States in January. To what degree is Hollywood actually looking towards the White House and Donald Trump? What changes can we anticipate?
Well, I think we can anticipate tariffs will be changing. So anything having to do with importation or other things like that, that's probably going to be affected. But mainly, Hollywood producers in particular and distributors are concerned with the relationship to China, because Trump has a very strong opinion on China. And even though it is not the big juicy market that they were hoping it was going to be maybe 20 years ago, it is still a big market. It is a big player in box office. And I think that the Trump administration could affect that quite harshly. So everybody's kind of holding their breath. Meanwhile, we've got Sylvester Stallone calling him the second George Washington.
Why is that?
Because, Sylvester likes to just go with the wind there. And he says Trump is like Rocky, man building his world from the ground up. But let's not forget that Trump started the old-fashioned way, the hard way, with his dad's money.
Excellent.
Yes.
Finally, let's touch on Steve McQueen, director of Blitz.
Yes.
Making a point in terms of some rather controversial comments made about cinematography.
It's really awkward because Camera-Image is a very respected event for cinematographers.
It's a film festival.
Yes, basically. That focuses on cinematography. And the chair, let's see if I can say his name properly. I probably can't. Marek Zadowicz, thank you.
Of the Polish director.
Yes. He gave a speech about the outdated notion of male superiority in the field and equate fairer gender representation with a drop in artistic values. It said, can we sacrifice
effectively
works?
saying that women aren't as good for cinematographers as men.
Yeah. He's saying basically if we embrace women, we're going to be dropping our standards.
Right.
And rightfully, Steve McQueen did not attend his premiere at that festival. And Cate Blanchett is the jury head. And I think that she said, hopefully they're going to have some meaningful discussions about this. I mean, the chief of the festival has apologized several times, but it's something that I think we have to recognize that if we are going to give people opportunities, then we have to make sure that they also have the opportunity to be excellent.
Karen Krizanovich, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. Now, the winner of the World Building of the Year award has been announced, and it's an Australian school. Well, to tell us more about it, I'm joined now by Tim Abrams, contributing editor to the Architectural Record and a regular voice here on Monocle Radio. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Emma. How are you?
Very well, thank you, but not quite as delighted, perhaps, as those who designed, built and now run Darlington Public School in Sydney.
Amazing. What a beautiful school to be able to go to. I don't know Redfern myself, a suburb of Sydney, but it's an inner city suburb, Victorian terraced area, not far from the university, and this dominated by the main railway line which runs through it. And the school picks up on the industrial architecture of the area. You arrive at it with this it's actually an existing school, which doesn't really come across in the citation, but it's an existing school which has been adapted, and there's this beautiful brick railway arch structure which has been created in front of it, which also houses new facilities. Then there's the existing building which has been refurbished inside, and a wonderful waffled perforated screen which opens up to a new garden. The screen is there to not just to create an interesting play area for the children, which it does, but also to act as a, shall we say, an acoustic screen to some of the more excitable members of the school community. So the residential area around is protected. Both the school is protected and the area around is protected. Lovely landscaping of the gardens, beautiful indigenous plants used as a teaching aid. A wonderful project.
Just explain to us, I mean, the significance of the World Architectural Festival in Singapore, and indeed World Building of the Year. I mean, enormous names, massively weighty event, tiny school. What does that say about the way that architecture is looking at itself at the moment?
That's a very, very interesting question. The World Architectural Festival, I mean, the capacity of architects to create awards for themselves should not be underestimated. The landscape is as wide as the field of architecture itself. And the World Architecture Festival is an innovation in this field. It began in 2008. It is, as its name suggests, an actual event which moves from city to city. This year it was held in Singapore. Next year it's going to be held in Miami. And it's an itinerant talking shop for the world premier architects. And in the initial stages, back in 2008, it was the big buildings, the big beasts which were awarded. The first winner was the Bocconi University in Italy by Grafton Architects, which is a brutalist building by any description, and one which has kind of summed up the dynamic of the time. And in recent years, and more recently, post-COVID particularly, the award has become more favouring more modest, more crafted buildings. The World Architecture Festival is also run by the same people that run the Architectural Review, a British magazine which is very scholarly and approaches these crafted buildings in the same way. And in recent years, there's been a convergence in taste, shall we say, between those two organisations.
Very quickly, we're running out of time. What little leaf do we take out of Darlington School's book?
The refurbishment, the retrofit is to be applauded and to be done well. It can be just as satisfying for architects to do as a completely new building. Craft, detail, thought, and some thought for the previous existing context of the building is all to be applauded.
Tim Abrams, thank you as ever for joining us here on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests. And thanks too to our producers, Vincent McAviney, Chris Chermak and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Sana Jimani and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance from Jack Dewars. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday in London and The Globalist is back at the same time on Monday. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening and have a great weekend.